I'd like to welcome everybody to LG lesson number 6. Today's subject is a continuation of our discussion of flexibility in LG, but today I wanted to incorporate specifically an idea that I've kind of showed off but not really emphasized, and that's called visual residue. So to go over what this lesson overall is going to cover, like I said, this is another in my flexibility meta series. Again, there's lessons of this series in LG, LR, and RC at this point, and so this is an overall theme of some of my new material. Last time, when it comes to flexibility in LG, though, we went over the four broad principles of my LG approach. Principle 0 is not really part of the flexibility thing. This is when you don't really need flexibility. Principle 0 covers situations where you actually understand the setup and you just set up the game. You know what to do, you know how to do it. There's really nothing to be that flexible about. Principle 1, though, is where it really gets into the situations where how do you stay flexible and keep moving forward when you don't really know what to do. If you look at the setup and you don't get it, and you can't do a Principle 0 approach, Principle 1 says that your goal is to understand the rules on an individual basis. It's great if you can chain them together into any kind of deduction. If you can see it, great, but don't really try too hard to see them. Your priority is, again, to understand the rules on an individual basis. Once you have done that, hopefully that has given you some idea of how to set up the game, but even if it hasn't, that's where Principle 2 jumps in. Lean on the rule checker for hints on how to diagram. Very often, the first question of every single game is, in fact, a rule checker. And that rule checker is nice because the answer choices for that question are generally going to be partial or hopefully complete sample diagrams. So that's where you can get an idea of how to diagram a game if you really have no clue how to do it. If that helps you, or even if it doesn't help you, you still have Principle 3 to fall back on, which is to just begin answering questions. And I know a lot of you may still feel a little bit uncomfortable about doing that. But surprisingly, if you can lean really hard on Principle 1 in terms of understanding the rules, even if Principle 2 doesn't pan out, you can just move on here to Principle 3 and begin answering questions, and surprisingly, you can get quite a bit of progress. So we went again, this is an overall sort of broad overview that we have seen in other lessons, but today's lesson will primarily focus on how I personally manage to stay flexible within just the context of Principle 3, or in other words, doing the questions without a whole lot of knowledge on how to set things up. This is something that you can demonstrate even if you do know how to set up a game. There's still a certain amount of flexibility that can help you move through questions quicker. So the first thing that I do when I'm answering questions, and I don't really have too many insights, the first thing I do is to look for any easy deduction-based eliminations. And that's usually this is only going to apply to a few questions later on in the section, simply because I generally do not find deductions up front. That's not really what I do. But if in the event that I have any deductions in my back pocket, that's what I'm going to look for first when it comes to eliminating answer choices. The second thing, after I've exhausted all the deductive possibilities, that's where I look for any rule-based eliminations. And these are different from deductions in that I don't really have to chain rules together. I can just literally go down the list of rules and say, oh, rule 2 makes this one not work. Rule 3 makes this one not work. That's what I mean by rule-based elimination. After having exhausted the rule-based eliminations, my third step is to look for any easy visual residue-based eliminations. And of course, you don't really know what visual residue exactly is yet. We'll go over that next slide, but that's just where it is in the procedure. And finally, fourth, after I have exhausted the visual residue-based eliminations, for any answer choices that remain, I refer to the table of power to figure out how I'm going to actually brute force a solution out of any answer choices that remain. I prefer to diagram each answer choice if possible, but I move to a non-diagramming analysis if diagramming isn't going to happen or doesn't feel that efficient. So to do the non-diagramming analysis, the first step is to formulate a proper question and then either use the entire list of rules to check an answer choice. So let's say you've done all the steps 1, 2, 3 here that we've gone over today, and you're still stuck between answer choice C and E. And if I'm checking C, at this point what I'm doing is, one thing that I could do is just go through rules 1 through 6, 1 through 3, however many it is that we have, and just use the entire list of rules to check answer choice C to see if I can eliminate that. Or I will check every alternative entity. So let's say answer choice C says that entity A goes into spot 2. I'm just going to figure out, okay, who else can go into spot 2? So instead of a rule-based approach, this would be an entity-based approach. So let's say instead of A, there's like B, C, D, and E. I'm going to see if B can fit into spot 2, if C can fit into spot 2, etc., and find if there's any way to avoid putting A in spot 2 if that's something that I need to do. These are all just, of course, abstract hypotheticals. I understand that they may not make a whole lot of sense without the benefit of an actual concrete question to do, but that's unfortunately the best I can do here in terms of just laying out my overall procedure. And that's kind of something that I'll approach at the very end again, the subject of, in the process of me pre-recording stuff, I have found that there's a huge drawback to pre-recorded stuff, which is that I have to talk like this. In reality, this is all a very fluid kind of process, but when I put it out here for you guys to follow along with, it just kind of takes on this sort of complex sounding thing, when really I think it's one of those things that is much easier to actually do than it is to explain, like a lot of other things in life. Alright, so to keep moving forward with our material today, I do want to end this slide by giving you the message of all this regimented stuff that I'm giving you here. Stick to this regiment early on in the game, but as you gain knowledge and familiarity with what matters in the game, don't hesitate to use any shortcuts you discover along the way, or to just skip around this list of procedures. I presented them as a list here, and I do, in fact, kind of follow this list on the first couple of questions, but that's usually enough by the time I'm done with the first 2 or 3 questions. I kind of know how the game works. I can pick and choose from here as I need. I can just kind of cut straight to the chase instead of starting, 1, 2, 3, 4, and just kind of going down the list the whole time. I skip right to rule 2 if I know that's important. Things like that. Any shortcuts that you know that you can take once you gain familiarity with the game on the first couple of questions, once you've been methodical, and once you have figured something out within the first couple of questions, that's when you can feel safer just kind of taking some shortcuts. Alright, so let's get to sort of the star of today's show, which is visual residue. And I kind of regret calling it the star, but I kind of have to because that's sort of the point of today's lesson, because a number of students have asked me to do so. But visual residue is this. It simply refers to the diagramming that you've done for previous questions. I believe on the online format of the exam now you're allowed up to 5 sheets of scratch paper. Don't quote me on that. I'm not sure if that's changed, but the last I checked it was 5. But you're allowed to use some scratch paper to use on test day. So that scratch paper is where I anticipate your visual residue will exist. And so visual residue for me is a pretty good tactic because I'm not shy about brute forcing the first few questions of almost any game that I do. I do end up with a lot of viable diagrams through the course of doing that. I can then use these viable diagrams to quickly eliminate choices in must be true or must be false questions, which have a pretty high standard of is this possible or is this not possible. Since I know I have a set of things that show what is possible, I can usually use that to make some progress on those must be true and must be false questions. On the flip side, for those more wishy-washy could be true or could be false questions, I can use my diagrams to confirm choices in those categories. If that's not enough, I can see if there are any rule or deduction based eliminations, and then brute force any remaining answers. So I do want to emphasize that, visual residue isn't a magic bullet. It's not going to solve every single one of your problems. That's where the table of power comes in. So the table of power, for those of you unfamiliar, it's something that I've put up in a lot of my material thus far, but it's a system that I use to efficiently brute force any answer choices that I haven't been able to eliminate in any other way. So it starts off it goes by category of question. So the first category that's easiest to deal with the table of power is any question that ends in could be true. If I am looking at any number of answer choices in a could be true question, and I'm trying to brute force it, the first thing I do is I plug in the answer choice that I'm testing as it is. I make no alterations to it. So if I'm testing answer choice A, I plug in A into the diagram exactly as it is. And then if I can get it to work, I select it. Simple as that. Because I've just literally proven that it could be true. The sister category to could be true is must be false. So if a question asks me if something must be false, what I do is I plug in the answer choice as it is. Again, I make no alterations to it. And if I can get that answer choice to work as it is, I eliminate it. Because then, of course, what I've just done is proven that it does not have to be false. If I got an answer choice to work and it just worked the way it was, I didn't have to make any changes to it, I've just proven that it doesn't have to be false. So, of course, I eliminate it. The third element of the table of power is the questions about must be true. And these are kind of the big ugly. They are the ones that are the most work intensive and have, I think, the highest propensity for error. But what I do here on must be true questions is I plug in an alternative to the answer choice. And if I can get that alternative to work, I eliminate the answer. And so there's instead of plugging an answer choice as it is, the alternative is something that can be a little bit touchy. I don't think in today's game that I'm going to be using to demonstrate flexibility is going to give us much opportunity to demonstrate this, but of course, feel free to email me if you really do want to see a specific demonstration of just must-be true questions and how the table of power helps you do them. But this is the basic procedure. If I am testing an answer choice in a must-be true question, you plug in an alternative to that answer choice, and if you can get it to work, you eliminate it. And finally, the sister category to the must-be true question is the could-be false question. For these, you plug in an alternative to the answer choice again. But this time, if you can get that alternative to work, you select the answer. So there's, it's fraught with just as much hazard as must be true questions in a certain sense. But at the very least, once you get something to work, you don't have to do anything else. That's your answer. What I do want to note here, though, is that every single one of these procedures in the table of power results in a viable diagram that honors all the rules. This is where visual residue comes from. Even if you have no clue how the game works and you are brute forcing the first 2 or 3 questions using the table of power, just plugging it in, if it works, select it, plugging it in, if it doesn't work, eliminate it, that sort of thing. Even if you have no idea what to do and you're just kind of going brute force one by one with the rules, you will end up with visual residue, and that can be useful on future situations if you know what you're doing. So the game that I'll be using to demonstrate flexibility and the powerful but still nonetheless limited utility of visual residue is going to be from Prep Test 69, Section 2, questions 18 through 23, which makes it the last game of the section. So as we always do, we'll start with the intro paragraph, which contains the following pieces of information. First thing we hear is that we are dealing with each of 5 paralegals, F, G, H, K, and L. So the each signifies that all of them are going to show up. Each of them is going to be assigned to exactly one case, R, S, and T. So that tells me that there's not really going to be repetition because there's exactly one paralegal, or each paralegal is assigned to exactly one case. They're only going to be playing for one team at a time, so there's not going to be any weird repetition. It's going to be F goes on which team, G goes on which team, per situation. And each of them is being assigned so they all do show up. So this is shaping up to be what looks like an ordinary grouping game. We get an additional condition here in the intro paragraph, which is that there is at least one paralegal per case. So there's never going to be a case that doesn't get any paralegals. There's always going to be at least one person in every group. This last consideration might qualify as a rule 0, but I'm thinking I can probably just hard code that information into my diagram. Speaking of which, our diagram is this one right here. Sorry, I had to take a couple button presses to make it appear. But yeah, it's just going to be a simple table with R, S, and T as our columns, and then that rule 0 that we were talking about, at least one paralegal per case, I am simply going to represent that with just putting a blank space into each column to make sure that we're not forgetting to fill at least one person into each group. So now that we have gone over the intro setup and the paragraph and discovered a rule 0 that we can do and all that kind of stuff, and have actually come up with a diagram, our next step is to understand the rules individually. So even if we know how to set up the game, we still have to deal with the rules. That's just how important that they are. So the rules. Rule number 1 is something that a lot of people who have asked me about this game have had questions about. It's the kind of rule that I think a lot of you guys get hung up on, but let's go over it. Either Frank is assigned to Rains and Kevin is assigned to Thompson, or Frank is not assigned to Rains and Kevin is not assigned to Thompson. There's really no conditions that trigger these situations, and that's what should stand out to you. We're just told straight up, either one situation is a case or the other situation is a case. There's nothing that triggers one or the other. It's simply we're either going to deal with this or we're either going to deal with this. Arguably, there are conditions within each of those that we can say kind of trigger one or the other, but that's not the hallmark of what I'm trying to point out here. If this kind of rule gives you trouble, interpret it the way that I did. There's no triggering factor about if something is the case, then F is in R and K is in D. There's none of that. We're just told straight up. There are 2 ways this plays out. Either F is in R and K is in T, or F is not in R and K is not in T. Those are the 2 basic ways that this whole thing plays out. That's what you need to understand about rule number 1. Rule number 2. It's kind of similar to rule number 1 in a sense because there's, again, not a triggering thing. This is just telling us the world looks a certain way, one way or the other. Our 2 options. F is going to be alone, or G is going to be alone. We have to have one of those 2, but not both. We can't have both alone at the same time. So either F is alone by himself, or G is alone, but not both. Again, another either or thing. There's no real conditions that really trigger that. That's just how the world is. And finally, we get to rule 3, which is another declaratory rule. It's just telling us how the world is. This one is much easier and much simpler, than rules 1 and 2. This is the one that just puts H in team S all the time. There's no conditions on it, and there's no either or. This is just straight up information. So that's interesting to me about this game. All of these rules don't really have separate conditions that really trigger them. Sure, we can kind of, see things within each rule that might be triggering conditions, but really, they're a little bit different than what we're used to. They are just telling us straight up that the world looks one way or the other, and that's it. That's just because that's what the rule says. There's no triggering condition that makes it that way. They're just telling us either F is alone or G is alone. It's always got to be that way, but not both. Similarly with rule number 1. And rule 3 is keeping up that theme, just even simpler. It's just straight up H's and S. That's it. Speaking of the simplicity of rule 3, that's exactly the kind of rule that we can throw directly into our diagram permanently, which we can do like so. So this is our blank table from the setup phase, and we just throw H in there, and it's as simple as that. Honestly, I would say this scenario is not the best, but it's also not the worst. Because rule 1, like I said, has this sort of bipolar thing. It tells us either the picture must look like this or it looks like that. We have F, R, and K, T, and that's kind of helpful, right? When we know that F is in R and K is in T, that's very certain. The flip side is a little less helpful to me. If F is not in R, that means that it's in S or T. There's no certainty there. And if K is not in T, then it's either in R or S. At least that's what it looks like on the face of the rule, and that's not quite as certain. So it's not quite two sides of the same coin. One side is far more certain than the other. So again, not the best, not the worst. It's fairly simple. It's just that it just so happens that the simple reality is that there isn't a whole lot of certainty there. Similarly with rule number 1, rule number 2, as I've been insinuating, works very much the same. It also needs us to keep track of two things at once. Someone among F or G has to be alone, but we need to make sure that it's not both of them. So again, just as we're either in the FR-KT scenario or not FR, not KT scenario, we are either in the F alone or G alone scenario. It's kind of a similar mechanic to me. So starting with our first question of the game, which is number 18, this one does happen to be a rule checker like we like to see, because these are generally easy and they kind of give us, it's a freebie basically. So as we always do, we'll just be going rule by rule and seeing which answers are eliminated based on which rule. So starting with rule number 1, it looks like we can use this one to eliminate both A and D, because again, to remind you, rule number 1 is that either if F is in R, then K ends up in T, and we have that grouping, or the situation is that F is not in R and K does not end up in T. Either way, both A and E have F in R, but K is not in T, which violates rule 1 on its face. Rule 2, in turn, allows us to eliminate C, because rule 2 is the one that tells us that either Frank is alone or Gina is alone, so either F is alone or G is alone, but not both of them, and C doesn't have either of them alone. In C, G is with K, and F is with H, so neither of them are alone. That violates rule 2. Rule 3 is a simple one. It's kind of flabbergasting that they would actually give this to us, but this one allows us to get rid of B, because we always have to have, rule 3 tells us that H is always in team S, but B is the one answer choice where H is not in S, so we can get rid of that on that basis. That means that we select D. D is the only one that doesn't violate any of the rules. One thing I want to note here is that since answer choice D actually gives us a complete diagram that works, this becomes a part of our visual residue for later. Sure, we didn't have to draw it out ourselves, they drew it out for us, but answer choice D, as written, gives us a diagram that works, so we can refer back to that if necessary or if it's helpful in the future. So now that we've worked through 18, let's hit number 19 real quick. Question number 19 is a must-be-false question. Which one of these can't be the full roster for S? So the first thing I'm going to do, as per the initial slide in our lesson today, is that I'm looking for any deduction-based eliminations, and that's a easy no for me. I didn't make any deductions during the setup or during question 18, so I really have nothing to do here. The second thing I do is look for any rule-based eliminations. The only thing that might matter is rule 3, at least sort of on its face, that I don't have to do any extra thinking about, and that's the one where H is always on team S. We know that any choice that doesn't include H in S cannot possibly be correct, but it's so rare that LG will just give away an answer like that, so I'm not really putting my hopes up. And I'm going to check the answer choice in case, and yeah, I do not see that low-hanging fruit anywhere. There is no situation on here where H is not on team S. So that's a bust. So the third thing I do, now that I've exhausted the deduction-based eliminations and the rule-based eliminations, I am going for visual residue. So again, answer choice D from question 18 is the only diagram that we have, and that has GH as the full S team, and that really doesn't help us with any answers here. So I'm now stuck on my fourth step, which is to just push onward with the table of power and try to brute force some answers out. So again, question number 19 is a must be false. Which one of these can't be the full roster for S? Answer choice A suggests that the pair FHK might be a full roster for S. We're going to see if this works. If it works, we're going to eliminate it because we've just shown that it can be the full roster. But if we luck out and FHK doesn't work for some reason, then we will be able to pick answer choice A. But we don't, either way, I have no clue going into it, so let's just kind of get through it here. So the first step is to reproduce the base diagram, which I will do like so. Here again, our base diagram is just our table with R, S, and T, and then rule number 3 always places H in team S, so that is the extent of what our base diagram does. Step 2, I will now consult the table of power. For must be false questions, what we're doing is we're plugging answers in as they are and trying to get them to work. If we succeed in getting that to work, then we eliminate the answer. So I'm going to do precisely that. Step 3 is to plug in answer choice A as it is. So I'm going to start by inserting F and K into team S because that's what it would do vis-a-vis our question stem. Again, our question stem is asking which one of these answer choices could represent the entire roster for team S, and so to do that with answer choice A, hypothetically we would throw F and K into S. Additionally, note that all 5 slots are placed after we do this, so we are all set on the numerical distribution of paralegals to teams. So it would look like this. We would just literally put F in there and K in there, and as I was mentioning, now we have 1 person in R, 3 people in S, and 1 person in T because there's only 5 paralegals to begin with. Step 4 is to think about now who is left. Looks like G and L are all that we have left. So in terms of placing G, the only restriction is that G must be alone since F isn't alone, and that's what rule 2 tells us. In terms of L, it looks like L really has no rule restrictions whatsoever. It can go anywhere with anyone on any team, so it is our floater. It appears that these two are fully interchangeable across teams R and T, and so that's how I would represent that, with G/L, L/G. So step 5, it looks like we now have a complete diagram. So what we need to do now is to do a quick rule check to confirm that it does in fact work. So rule number 1, we're all good here. We are in the F is not in R, so K is not in T, as rule 1 mandates. We do have that, so that works out. Rule number 2, we're also all good on. G is going to be alone in R or T no matter what we do. So that is as, of course, rule 2 mandates. Since F isn't alone, G has to be alone at some point, but G is, of course, going to be alone. So we're all good there. And rule 3, that was good ever since we drew our base diagram. H is on team S. So since this was a must be false question, but we got answer choice A to work, we eliminated. On to B. So that does bring us to answer choice C, but here is where I did things a little bit differently. Before pushing mindlessly into C, D, and E, the rest of the choices, I did at this point finally notice something from the work that I did on A and B. I noticed that every answer choice in the entire list, A through E, puts 3 people into Team S. That's actually very restrictive because it forces us into the 1-3-1 numerical distribution that you saw in the tables that I made for both answer choice A and answer choice B. What I mean by 1-3-1 here, for those of you who aren't aware of what numerical distribution means, it means that Team R on the left has 1 person in it. Team S in the middle has 3 people in it, and Team T at the end has 1 person in it. And that's a set thing. And it's not like there's like 2-2-1 or 2-1-2 or some weird variability like that. It's just set at 1-3-1. That's what happens when you put 3 people into Team S. And that's very restrictive. And that's something that we actually tend to like to do in very open-ended games because it gives us some restriction and some certainty and some finality. The notable thing about the 1-3-1 distribution, like I've been saying, is that it forces 2 paralegals to work alone. Whoever ends up on Team R, as we saw in answer choice A and B, is alone. And whoever ends up on Team T is also alone. Paralegals working alone. Where else have we heard that? Turns out we heard about that in Rule 2. Rule 2 specifically is about the paralegals F and G working alone. Specifically, F has to work alone or G has to work alone. One of those two always has to be alone. We just can't have both of them be alone at the same time, as the rule says. So Rule 2 tells us that we are in a lot of trouble in a 1-3-1 distribution if both F and G get forced out of the 3-size team and into the 1-size teams, because that specifically forces both F and G to be alone, and that is a very specific and upfront violation of Rule 2, which tells us that both of them cannot be alone, even if one of them has to be. So an answer that puts all the other letters, which are H, K, and L, onto Team S would do that. Because again, if you put H, K, and L into Team S, that leaves just the letters F and G, and where are the only places F and G can go? It's just some combination of either it's going to be in R or it's either going to be in T. Either way, both F and G are going to end up alone, and that is not allowed by Rule 2. So E does precisely that. E puts H, K, and L all on the same team in Team S, which means that it must be false, and therefore we have to select E as our answer. So a couple of notes here. If you noticed right away, even without doing diagramming on A and B, that all 5 answer choices resulted in the 1-3-1 distribution, you could have made the connection to Rule 2 and not done any of the diagram work that I did for A and B. That is probably the quote-unquote correct way to do this in terms of how the designers wanted to intend people to do it. It may have been, if they do design things in terms of effort and time budget involved, they probably intended on you to be able to do that. But chances are that you, like me, didn't see that right away, and that's fine. Like I said, I just didn't see it until I did A and B. But in the future, if you want to be able to catch this insight at a similar point that I did, do what I did here. Start brute forcing, but keep an eye out for things that seem off. And this off concept is probably what is most fluid and variable and personalized here. But for me, it felt off because I understood that the 1-3-1 distribution, it felt quite restrictive and kind of nice in that sense. I felt like there was a lot of certainty that it added to the game. Yet at the same time, it was so easy and painless to interchange stuff within that 1-3-1 distribution between answer choice A and answer choice B. I literally just switched a couple of letters and it still worked out. And so that was off to me. 1-3-1 felt restrictive. It felt like it gave me a lot of certainty, but at the same time there was still a lot of uncertainty in there, oddly enough. That was a sign to me that there's some key restriction that the answer choices weren't really touching, that there's something else going on, that an answer choice focused entirely on Team S wasn't really flagging. And that's what led me to kind of look outside of the S column, and I looked at R and T, and I was like, oh, I noticed that whoever is in R has to be alone, and whoever is in T has to be alone. And that's what got me to think, oh, so that means 2 paralegals have to be alone. Where have I heard something about people working alone? Rule 2. So yeah, that's what ultimately led me to see the relevance of Rule 2. It was just me being able to detect that there was a helpful restriction in 1-3-1, but at the same time, it wasn't all that it was cracked up to be. It wasn't what I was hoping. It wasn't what I was used to. That there was still a lot of variability in an otherwise restrictive-looking scenario, and that just got me looking around the board for other characteristics. Like, there's got to be something else going on. Why do I feel like this should be more restrictive, yet it isn't? There has to be something else, and that's when I noticed Rule 2. So here's the other sort of, I guess, threat that's hanging out there. So I have just discussed how I personally got to the understanding of Rule 2's relevance to this question. But if you can't really get the hang of keeping an eye out, as I've just suggested here, it's really not the end of the world, especially when you're dealing with just the second question of the game. It's really not the end of the world if you don't catch this insight. This being a must-be false question, it really would not have taken too long to just plug in answer choices C and D as is, because that's what the table of power would have you do on this question. You just plug it in as it is, and just work them out. It would have been just as fast as our work on answer choices A and B, which, as you saw, didn't really take all that long. It's a 1-3-1 distribution. We only have 5 entities. That's not a whole lot. And there are only 3 rules, which is really not a whole lot when it comes to a game. And so, having done so in terms of doing diagrams for C and D, having done that would have also resulted in a bit more visual residue that you could benefit from later on. So really, for the second question, even if you didn't quite get this insight and didn't quite save as much time as I did here, that's not really a huge deal. My response to that would change later on in the section, but here on question 19, which is like the first real question of the game, it's okay. So now that we have kind of put question 19 behind us, let's dip into question 20 here. This one I am a little bit more lost on even than 19. If exactly 2 people are assigned to Team T, what could be the complete roster of Team R? What could be true, in other words, of Team R's complete roster? I really didn't know where to start on this one. None of our question 19 work dealt with exactly 2 people on Team T. And question 18 didn't have that scenario either. Answer choice D, our correct one from there. So I didn't have any visual residue or any deductions, really. And if I just look at the rules, there's quite a bit that I don't really know about the R team and the T team. Rule 1 could either tell me a lot about both teams, or could tell me absolutely nothing about both teams. Either we know that R contains both F, R contains F and T contains K. That's the first situation mandated by Rule 1. Or if that's not the exact scenario that we have, then we are not allowed to have F and R, and we are not allowed to have K and T. But there's a number of ways we can satisfy that, right? It's not just simply flipping the 2 around. That's not the only way. There may be some other combination of things that we can do. So yeah, Rule 1 is kind of bipolar. It could either tell me a lot or tell me nothing, and ultimately that means when I don't know where to start, it tells me nothing. So the choice is pretty simple. I'm just going to have to start brute forcing this one. Hopefully along the way we'll find something that helps us, or maybe even answer choice A will be the first one to work. Either way, I'm just going to hope for the best and keep moving. So again, here's our question stem again. If exactly 2 people are assigned to Team T, what could be the complete roster for Team R? And answer choice A suggests that maybe G could be the complete roster for Team R. So let's just plug that in and see what happens. So as always, we start with our base diagram here, which should be familiar to you by now. And step 1 tells us, my step 1, the first thing I did, was that the question stem for question 20 says that exactly 2 people are assigned to Team T. And I don't really know who it is yet, but I'm going to just put a second blank in Team T. And I'm going to mark that with blue just to show you that it came from the question stem, not from anywhere else. Stuff in red comes from the answer choice, stuff in blue comes from the stem, and stuff in purple is the stuff that I'm just kind of guessing or trying to figure out. So that's the first place I'm going to look if something goes wrong. So moving on to step 2, answer choice A alleges that G is in Team R and that G is alone, that she represents the complete team. So that's what this looks like. We put G into R, and we put another blank into S, because if G is alone in R, as according to answer choice A, and there are exactly 2 paralegals in Team T, which came from the question stem of question 20, that is the picture that we end up with here. I throw G into R and G is alone. And if G is alone and T has exactly 2 people in it, that means there's exactly 1 more person that goes into S, and that's mandated by putting G alone in answer choice A for Team R. So now that we have inserted that information, if G is alone in Team R, Rule 1 tells us that we cannot have the FRKT scenario. Since we cannot possibly have Frank in Team Reigns, we cannot also have, we're not allowed to put K in the Team T roster either. Because if we do that, we have to have both conditions fulfilled, and we don't have one of them. So therefore, that puts us solidly in the F is not in R and K is not in T scenario. So that tells us that K cannot be in T. I am going to place K first because I think that's going to be more restrictive. We just found out that K cannot go in R since G is alone there. And it also cannot go into T because of Rule 1, so I was right. K was more restricted. The only place K can go is into Team S. So again, answer choice A suggests that G is alone in Team R, so that's why G is alone. The question stemmed from question 20 tells us that there are only 2 people in Team T. And even if there's space for 2 people there, none of those spaces can go to K, because since G is alone, F isn't in R, and if F isn't in R, we cannot put K into T. So the only place K can go is S, because it can't go into R, can't go into T. And as for F, now that we know that K is forcibly placed in S, and there's no more room in S, F is now forced to go into T. So that's what happens. First we throw K into S, as we were saying, and now we put F into T, as we were just saying. Step 4, L is the last paralegal remaining. What do you know? There are just 0 limitations from the basic setup and the rules on where L can go. As we found out in question 19, L is one of our floaters, so it can go anywhere. So L can go into either S or T at this point, so that means we only have room to put it into T, because there's no more room in S. So now we have another quick diagram to check against all the rules. Rule 1, all good. We have avoided FR and KT at the same time, so that's good. That satisfies rule number 1. Rule number 2, we're all good. G is alone, but F is not alone, so we do have one of those 2 alone, but not both of them, so that's good. And rule 3, we're also all good. Again, from the very beginning, we've always made sure to throw H into Team S, so that's always been satisfied. So since G, being the complete roster for Team R, works, and it therefore could be true, we select A. So we really lucked out here. So I understand if you didn't quite follow some of the reasoning that I did. If you guys are having any trouble, it's probably interpreting Rule 1, so I'll be happy to go over it with you more specifically. But just to kind of preserve runtime, I decided not to get into it too deeply here. But yeah, basically, if you apply all 3 rules as you're supposed to, this is what you end up with. And yeah, answer choice A works. Lucky us, right? We plugged in G and it worked, and this could be true question, so that ends up there. Now when it comes to the next question, 21, this again played out a little bit differently. Question 21 reads, if one of the teams is exactly the pair G and L, they don't tell us which team it is, they just tell us that one of the teams is exactly these 2 people. All of these answer choices must be false, except for which one. So there is a sort of deductive elimination that I might want to try here. We just saw in question 19 that the potential importance of rule 2, which is that F or G has to be alone, but not both of them can be alone. It gives us both a little bit of interchangeability between F and G, but it also gives us some restriction on F and G. We saw that in question 19 is very problematic when both of them had a potential of being forced to be alone. Question 21 stem tells that G is not alone. So we know that we're already forced to make sure that F is in fact alone. So this is just kind of a piggyback on what I was talking about with F and G and that in rule number 2. Because this question stem pairs G with another letter, for sure, we know that no matter what happens, G is not alone. So F being alone is the only way to fulfill rule 2, so we know now that F has to be alone. I'm not sure that really tells us much though. According to our base diagram, the one place we know that F can never ever be alone is on Team S, because H is always there. Fortunately for us, answer choice B says precisely this, so we know it has to be false. We know it must be false that F is on Team S, because we know that F has to be alone in this scenario, and F cannot possibly be alone if it's ever assigned to Team S. So we get to eliminate B. But I don't really see anything else that we can eliminate on its face based on sort of like a deduction kind of approach. And again, I put deduction in quotes because it wasn't really a solid deduction from 19. It's just I noticed that rule 2 was important there. I looked there and there was some yield to it here. So now that we have gone through the deductive things, for the same question 21, are there any rule-based eliminations that we can do? So again, piggybacking on our deduction-based elimination from the last slide, we notice that since G is not alone, rule 2 tells us that F must be alone. F must therefore be on Team R or Team T, right? Because last time we figured out that F cannot be on Team S. The implication there is that, okay, F has to be on Team R or Team T, and it must be alone. So with this sort of updated fact, I'm going to go through all the rules now, and there's only 3 of them, right? And see if anything comes of this. Rule number 1 tells us that if F goes into R, we are put into the FRKT scenario. If F goes into T, we are in the not FR, not KT scenario. But I don't really see anything immediately that makes us put F into either R or T. I don't really know which one we have to choose at this point, or if we even have to choose, maybe we have an option. Who really knows, right? So rule number 2, we've already discussed the importance of this, and there's really nothing further to discuss. All we figured out is that F has to be alone wherever they go, because G is not alone. Therefore, F is the only one who is capable of satisfying rule 2. So it has to be alone, but we've already begun talking about that. There's nothing new to add here. Rule 3 has already been discussed, and it never needs to be discussed because we are always just going to put that first in our diagram. H is going to go in team S, and that's final. So there's really nothing else to add there. So sadly, I really don't see anything else I can get rid of based purely on the rules. So that does push us into brute force territory a little bit here. So again, same question. If one of the teams is exactly the pair G and L, all of these must be false except for which one. So as I've been saying, we've now been through both the deduction-based and rule-based eliminations. So let me think about visual residue and brute force at this point. ATD isn't exactly the situation we're looking for in terms of it doesn't have G and L as a pair together, but I get the feeling just looking at answer choice D for AT that we might be able to adapt it easily enough. This is the same feeling that I had for answer choice A on question 19. I looked at answer choice B and I looked, okay, I was like, I can probably make answer choice B really look a lot like answer choice A, so I may as well just kind of reproduce A and then twiddle with it until I get it to work. Same thing here. Even though the correct answer choice at D from question number 18 doesn't really incorporate the GL pair that I'm looking for, I think I can make it work. So here we go. First thing we do is reproduce, what answer choice D said from question 18. And that one, to refresh your memory, answer choice D says that K and L are on team R, H and G are on team S, and F is alone on team T. So step 1 is to ask ourselves, can we turn this into a situation where G and L are on a team together and that they are the entire team? It seems so. The easiest way, visually for me to do that, it looks like we can just switch K and G. That's where my mind goes. I see K and L together, let's make that G and L together. That's literally my thought process. So let's do that. Let's take away where K and G are now and just flip their position. So now we have GL and HK. So step 2 is to do our rule check, because we have a complete picture here. Rule number 1, we have not FR, okay, F is in T, so that checks out, and we have not KT, K is in S, so that checks out. That is, so we do have one of the 2 scenarios that Rule 1 mandates that we have. Specifically, we have the not FR and not KT scenario, so we're all good there. Rule number 2, we have the GL block, but F is, so G and L are together on team R, but F is alone on team T, so Rule 2 has been satisfied. Rule 3, we have H in team S, as has been mandated by Rule 3 since basically the beginning of time, so we're all good there. So step 3, now we need to ask ourselves, we have a complete diagram where we do, as the question stem tells us, we do have G and L together on a team, and they are the complete team. Does this help us with any answer choices? And yes, it does. We see that the GL team can be on team R, which means it does not have to be false in answer choice C. So that's why we select answer choice C. So again, this question was a must be false, except all the answers that we eliminate are ones that have to be false. We are picking the one that does not have to be false, i.e. it could be true. So I plugged in the GL restriction. I didn't so much plug it in as I took question number 18's correct answer and modified it very easily to make it reflect our question system here. And then I worked it through, checked all the rules, and it looks like G and L can be in team R. So yeah, that possibility does not have to be false. It's definitely workable. We just proved it here. So we pick C and we are done. So note here that unlike question 19, I am not saying that it's still totally fine at this point, if you did catch the rule interactions that made this faster. I mean, if you didn't see it, you can brute force this one with the GL block from the question stem and use the table of power across all the answer choices, but ideally you want to keep your wits about you, so that by the time you get to the 4th question of the game, as 21 is, you have some idea of how things work. Again, I really don't know how to explicitly describe the situation because it varies from game to game, but basically by the time you get to the 4th question, you should have some sense of the rules that matter. And for me, it really boils down to Rule 2, and that interaction is really what's kind of driving a lot of my insights for this game. But either way, you should have something that kind of shows you what's going on. And that is, in and of itself, is another manifestation of what I'm trying to teach you in terms of LG flexibility. Brute force is a great tool to get you started when you have no idea what to do. In fact, that's where I start a lot of the most difficult games, because that's why they're difficult. They're hard to set up. But ideally, your brute force work will result in some easy to get insights along the way. And really, I didn't have to do any particularly deep, masterful, super secret, insightful thinking. It's literally on question number 19, I did answer choice A, and then I did answer choice B. And then after doing those two and coming, face to face again and again with rule 2, I was like, wait a minute. Actually, maybe rule 2 is important to this question. And I noticed that finally all the answer choices force us into a 1-3-1 distribution, and then that makes rule 2 very important, because the one thing that we know we can't allow to happen is to have F and G be forced out into R and T, and then that kind of cascaded from there. But it wasn't some super secret thing. It was just repeatedly seeing that rule 2 mattered, and I'd be like, let's think about this a little bit more. Maybe it does actually matter in some way that I missed. And like I was saying, don't worry about having to be super insightful. Just literally just try to notice these things as you work. What rules come up again and again? That should give you some alarm bells. That should make you think a little bit. And so yeah, I'm repeating myself at this point. Question 19, literally all it was just, hey, I finally noticed that there are two paralegals that are forced to be alone, two paralegals alone. Rule 2 is literally about two paralegals, F and G, being alone. It's not some super secret thing. Question 21 really is even simpler. Rule 2 tells us that F and G can't be alone at the same time, but that at least one of them has to be alone. Question 21 tells us that G isn't alone, so that forces F to be alone. And that's literally all that it turned out to be. So let's push on to question 22 before I repeat myself yet again. Which one of these can't be the complete roster for Team T? So this is a must-be-false question. Here now, because we're getting near the end of the section, and we have quite a bit of visual residue. I will not quite as much as we have for some other games, but we have a decent amount, I think. I'm moving a little bit out of order. Visual residue is the first place I go because it's so low effort. We have several diagrams to check for complete versions of Team T. So question 18 puts, at least answer choice D, puts F alone as the entirety of Team T. That unfortunately doesn't eliminate anything from this list, because they never do suggest that F could be alone. So we can't really eliminate that. Question number 19, answer choice A. This indicates that either G can be alone as the entirety of the roster of Team T, or L can be alone. This is helpful. It eliminates both answer choices A and B for us, which suggests those two things precisely. Question 19B. That doesn't really add anything new to us. We considered that already in 18, but this one also has G alone as the complete roster for Team T, and so we already considered that, so that doesn't really add anything for us. And finally, let's do question 20, answer choice A. F and L are Team T, and that's it, but that doesn't really eliminate anything from this list either. So now that I've skipped ahead to visual residue, I'm just going to kind of go back to the rest of my list and try to do that in order at least. Deduction-based eliminations, again, I haven't really deduced anything other than the importance of Rule 2, and that's hardly a real deduction, so there's nothing really that I can do. As for rule-based eliminations, Rule 2, like I said, came up a number of times. Let's see, do any of these answer choices as written run afoul of being able to keep exactly one of F or G alone? So answer choice C seems okay superficially. The pair of G and K being on Team T means that G is not alone, so F must be alone. No problems yet. I don't really see why we can't have F alone based on this alone. I don't have a diagram or anything. I just don't see anything on its face that makes this wrong. Rule 1, though. K is on Team T in the world suggested by answer choice C. So that does mean that we are in FRKT mode. And again, at this stage, just like with Rule 2 analysis, I don't see why we can't actually put F into R to make all this work. So there's no guaranteed problems yet. And at this point, because we've placed 3 out of the 5 paralegals already, we have placed F, G, and K, I'm thinking we may as well finish out the diagram. So again, we have our base diagram here. We are going to insert G and K as the complete roster for Team T, as the answer choice suggests. So that forces, as we just figured out, thanks to Rule 1, that F goes into R. So, and F also has to be alone, so that means that the last person has to be L, which we put into Team S. Because again, answer choice, or the question, suggests that G and K are the entire roster of Team T, so there's nobody else who can go in there. Nobody can go with F, so L, the only place it can go, is on Team S with H. So quick rule check, and we will go one by one. Rule 1 we kind of just did. K is on Team T, F is on Team R, so we're into FRKT mode, and that's okay with rule number 1. Rule number 2, G is not alone, but F is, so that checks out. And rule 3, H is, of course, as always, thrown to Team S, so it all checks out. So we get to eliminate C based on this. So moving on to answer choice D for 22. D, kind of like C, seems okay superficially. D suggests that G and L as a pair are the entirety of the roster on Team T. That means, just like last time, that since G is not alone, it being paired with L here, F must be alone according to Rule 2. And again, there seem to be no problems at this point if Rule 2 is the first thing we consider, just based on the answer choice alone. I don't really see any problems just yet. G is not alone, so F has to be alone. Looping back to Rule 1, since K is not on Team T, again, the answer choice suggests that GL is all of Team T, so there's no room for K on there. That puts us, according to Rule 1, in not FR, not KT mode. So K is not on T, and that forces F out of R, because if we do have either F and R or K and T, that must mean that we have to have both of them there at the same time. We can't really mix and match according to rule number 1. So what that really means is that when it comes to F, we can't put F into R because of rule 1, because we're in not FR, not KT mode. We also can't put F into T because answer choice D tells us again that GL is the entirety of Team T. That forces F into S, which is a problem. We need F to be alone according to rule 2, because G can't be alone, so F has to be the one to be alone here. But it can never be alone if we put it into Team S according to rule 3. But remember that rule 1 doesn't allow us to put F into R or T, and it forces us to put F into Team S, which then also forces a conflict with rule 3 here. So because doing what D suggests always results in a conflict between rule 2 and rule 3, and arguably rule 1 as well, we have to select D. It has to be false. It cannot be, GL cannot be the complete listing of people on the Thompson case. I guess I could do a diagram for this one as well if you guys want to, but again, my goal is to keep runtime low, and I actually didn't need to do a diagram for this one. I want to demonstrate how I got there, so this is what it is. So that brings us now to question 23, the final one of this set, and this one is if K is alone. So that's the starting condition. This is all based on the idea that K is alone. Who are all the people eligible to appear in Team R? Take care to note that this is not one of the complete team questions that we've seen several of so far. They're not suggesting that any of these answer choices represent a complete team. They're just saying who is eligible to even show up in the R column in a situation where K is alone. So the first thing to think about is, have we seen K alone before anywhere in our previous work? And yes, we have in our visual residue. Specifically, question 19b, the work that we did there, shows that K is alone in Team R. That means that in at least one situation, question 19b, where K is alone, K also happens to be eligible to appear in Team R. We eliminate anything in this list that doesn't have K in it, because as we just proved, K is eligible to show up in Team R whenever K is alone. There is a situation in which that's possible. So any list that doesn't include K cannot possibly show everybody who's eligible. So we eliminate C and D based on that alone. Nice. Continuing to move on, now looking at A, B, and E. K appears in all three of those, so there's really no point in testing K's eligibility since we knew it was going to be eligible to show up anyway. So, but it doesn't, because it's common to all three, testing it wouldn't really tell us anything. F appears in 2 of them, and L appears in just 1 of them. I'm going to start with F because it has more impact. If we can figure out that F is not eligible to appear on the list, that means that we get rid of 2 out of the 3 answers, so that's where I'm going to start. So, when K is alone, is it possible for us to get F into Team R, as we were just discussing? So, if F is indeed in Team R, then K can't go into a couple different places here. That's where my mind is going. K can't go into R because F is there and K needs to be alone per the setup of question 23. That also means that K cannot go into S because H is there And as we just discussed, K needs to be alone per question 23. So that's the consequence of trying to throw F into R. We can't really fit K into R or S, so what that tells us is that that leaves T as the only place that K can go. And because I'm beginning to lose track of what's going on, I'm going to start diagramming this out. So we have our base diagram here. And again, what we're trying to test is if F can go into R, so we'll throw F in there. And just so you can follow along, once F is in R, where are we going to place K? Because K has to be alone, and K is an important thing to question 23. That's why I'm investigating that next. So where can we throw K, and where can it be alone? Well, as we just said, it can't be in R because F is just there, because that's what we're testing. And we can't put K in there because then K wouldn't be alone, and the whole premise of this question is that K is alone. Obviously, we have H in our picture here in Team S, so K can't go there either. Again, so as I was just saying, that leaves T as the only place that K can go. So that's why we have it there. So when we think about the rest of this, we see that Rule 1 tells us that we are solidly in FRKT territory. That's exactly what our picture has here, right? So that conforms to that version of the world that Rule 1 set up for us. Rule 2 tells us that F has to be alone. And we know this because there's no, and so this is a little bit of trickery here. I know that F has to be alone because we have to add G somewhere to this picture, right? G has to show up. But if you notice, there's no way for us to make G be alone, ever, at this point. No matter whether we put an R, S, or T, G can never be alone. So according to Rule 2, F has to be the one to take off the mantle of the one being alone. So now we know that F has to be alone, according to Rule 2. And since the question makes K alone, and F is alone in Team R, we are again in a 1-3-1. The only place to put G and the only place to put L is in Team S, like so. So let's just do a quick rule check. Again, R1, we have FR and KT, as Rule 1 tells us is one of the only possibilities. That works out. Rule 2, F or G has to be alone. F is alone in this case, G is not, so we have satisfied Rule 2. And rule number 3, H is in Team S. We, of course, always satisfy that rule anyway. That's not even something to consider. It's all good. So F is definitely a candidate. F can indeed go into R in a scenario where K is alone, just as we have here. So now, our final frontier is to test L. So just a quick recap to make sure that we are all on the same page. We have confirmed that in scenarios when K is alone, it is possible for K to show up in R, and it is possible for F to show up in R. That narrows it down to answer choices A and B for us. And now to make it, the only difference between answer choice A and B is whether or not L can show up in R as well. And so we are now testing that. So when K is alone, can we find a way to get L into Team R? So just like last time, I'm going to start with the same procedure. Our goal is to see if we can get L into Team R. Once we have placed L into Team R, now we need to make sure that there is some place that K can be placed such that it is alone as per the demands of question 23. So if L is in R, then K cannot go into R because L is already there, and we just said K needs to be alone because that's what question 23 tells us. It is also impossible, for K to go into S because H is there, and again K needs to be alone because of question 23. So that leaves T as the only place that K can go. So diagramming again, just like last time, we have here our base diagram. We'll throw L into Team R because that's what we're testing, and then we just figured out K needs to be alone as per the question stem of question 23. So can't put K into R, can't put K into S. K has to go into T, and K, that's the only place that we can keep K alone now. Alright, so far so good. Now let's go through a rule check and see what else is going on. Rule number 1, just like last time, tells us that we are solidly in FRKT territory. Because the only two possibilities allowed by Rule 1 is that F is in R and K is in T. Or the other possibility is that F is not in R at the same time K is not in T. That's the other possibility. And since we can't fulfill that other one because K definitely is in T here, that means that we are stuck in the F is in R and K is in T territory. So we have to throw F in the R team here as a result. Rule 2, though, presents us with a problem. As I just said, we just found out from Rule 1 that F goes into Team R. So far, so good, right? If we move down to Rule 2 now adds that G has to be alone. Remember, somebody has to be alone between F and G. Not both of them, but at least one of them has to be alone. But just look at our diagram here. Where could we add G now at this point to make it be alone? We also can't make F alone because LHK was already kind of taking up that first row. So there's no way for us to get G to be alone, and G does have to be the one to be alone as per Rule 2 right now. But there's no way for us to do that. There's no way to place G that allows G to be alone. So because it is impossible to keep K alone, put L into R, and satisfy Rule 2, we have figured out that L cannot go into R, while we have proven that F can and K can. So that means that we get to eliminate answer choice A and select B. So mercifully, we have reached the end of this particular set of questions. So now, time for the takeaways. I am actually, as an instructor, pretty unhappy with how weird it was to cover question 23 the way that I did. I think that what I put up is an authentic representation of my thought process, but it just looks dense on paper. And as I was alluding to earlier, this seems to be a problem innate to almost all pre-recorded instruction. In reality, all it was just two tables. It was just the base diagram with different letters on it, and it didn't look nearly as complicated. And I was able to just fill it in. Again, this is a fairly friendly situation in terms of how easy it is to rediagram as needed. The table is not very big. It's just 3 columns, R, S, and T. We already know there's 5 entities to be placed, and we already know where one of those 5 is always going to be. We always know where H is. So we're really only moving 4 letters around. It's not the most complicated game to diagram. So it really isn't that hard to replicate your work and just kind of iterate on it, really. It's just that when I'm trying to do it neatly in a sort of presentable format here, I've got to accompany it with text and all that stuff, and it just doesn't look quite as fluid and easy as it is in reality. So despite that though, that aside, hopefully you noticed the important thing, which is I started this whole game, the whole situation, quite regimented. You could literally follow the list that I put up on the first slide and what I was doing. I would start with deductions if I had any. I'd then move to rules. Then I'd move to visual residue. Then I'd move to brute force and try to kind of recycle the list after that point. But I would still move pretty much from 1 to 4 pretty easily. But as the whole game wore on, I gained insight into the continuing importance of Rule 2. I kept butting up against that again and again, right? And then on top of that, I had built up visual residue, not starting with question number 18, answer choice D. And then 19 also generated a few things, and I believe 20 may have generated a little bit of residue for us as well. And so I built up a number of pictures that worked, and I was able to engage them to some extent, I believe, on 22. But I mean, it still wasn't that groundbreaking, but at the same time, it was a nice security blanket to have. But as the real important thing is, as I built the visual residue and I learned the more important things that mattered about the mechanics of the game, my process got less tied to a specific order of things. And the process became much more about what got me faster eliminations with less thinking and less drawing. And that's really the takeaway. One way of doing flexibility is to start very regimented when you don't know what is going on. Start very regimented. Just be like, okay, since I don't know what's going on, let's see if we can make any eliminations based on deductions. No? Well then, can we make any eliminations based on rules? No? Can we make any eliminations based on visual residue? No. Well then, we're just going to brute force. And so you kind of stick with that order. So work carefully, as I was just describing, in order, and gain insights and visual residue through doing the first few questions. Again, if you're dealing with the typical rule checker questions, at the very beginning, that's already some free visual residue right there. But yeah, be deliberate as you're doing things. Try to catch insights when you can in the very simple, sort of brain-dead, superficial ways that I described. Then begin to take shortcuts and make use of your previous work later on. Sure, the sort of pure brute force caveman-esque level, I would say, is both encouraged and acceptable by the first 2 or 3 questions max. I would say there should be a hard turning point after question 3 is complete. After question 3 is complete, at least the last 2 or 3 questions of the game, you should be having some insights, even if it's not to the level of the super secret deductions that all the other test prep folks out there are talking about. You should still at least learn stuff like, hey, Rule 2 matters, so I'll look into Rule 2 first. Or whatever the case may be for whatever game it is that you're working on. You will have come up against either some rule or some entity. Maybe it's not even some rule specifically or some entity specifically, but maybe just some interaction of like Rule 3 with a set of entities, something like that. there's going to be something that comes up again and again. It is on you to pick up on that and keep your eye on it. It doesn't mean that you have to turn into some secret, I will understand and unravel the entire thing with just one, snap of my fingers. That's not necessarily how these things work. But at the same time, if you understand the things that keep coming up again, and that's where you put your mind, you'll still be able to work efficiently through what remains. And so finally, I want to reiterate a note that I kind of made in passing very early on in the lesson, is that visual residue isn't a magic bullet. I've been approached about students as the November exam, which is coming right up on you guys, November 2022, where people have kind of discovered the potency of having diagrams completed for previous questions and are afraid to use them to the extent that it's justified. But on the flip side, it's kind of a bipolar issue. I run into a lot of students who are way too eager to use previous work, not realizing that their previous work may not apply to future questions based on limitations, right? That one question provides that other questions do not. So there's a lot of uncertainty for people there. And so hopefully what I demonstrated is that you have to be kind of careful, but at the same time, even if a picture doesn't exactly match what you're hoping to have, if you understand how the game works, you can quickly adapt the previous work that you do have to make it work for the next picture. You can be flexible within that piece of flexibility there. So yeah, in particular, remember question 21, where we took a picture from question 18 that wasn't exactly what we're looking for. But because we learned how the game worked on questions 18, 19, and 20, by the time we got to 21, it seemed like we can reconfigure the question 18 picture to suit our needs. And we got lucky that the first lowest effort attempt, which is literally just switch the two letters that you wanted to switch, got us an answer choice. So that we did kind of luck out there. But yeah, I mean, it's that this is the hard part about teaching flexibility, is that I'm trying to cover all my bases, but that is hard to do when the whole premise of the lesson is that there's a lot of bases to cover. Flexibility can be any number of things. And again, I don't want to pigeonhole anybody into doing things exactly the way that I've demonstrated here. What I've shown you here is just what I did on one particular game. It worked for me here. It may not even work for you in this situation. What makes you think that you can just take this exact same procedure and make it work on something radically different for yourself, right? You're not me. This game is not the same one that you might be doing in the future. There's no guarantee that it works. What I want you to take away from today's work here is that you can start really regimented when you don't know things. And then your goal should be on the first 2 or 3 questions, as you brute force things, learn how the thing works. Learn how it works. Learn what matters. Learn what entities keep coming up again. What sort of things trigger alarm bells? Like, man, the last time I saw G in this spot, that caused me a lot of trouble. I want to be careful. That sort of level of insight is all that you need. You don't need the super secret magic deductions. You don't need that stuff. All you need is this sort of spidey sense, that awareness, that vague awareness of what matters to you as you're constructing diagrams, and that will be enough for you to move efficiently through the remainder of the section. But you do need to pick up some of those things along the way. So the goal initially is not just to just mindlessly brute force things when you don't know what else to do, but use that opportunity as you're brute forcing answers out to learn how the game works. And you will discover, if you get the questions right through brute force, you will by necessity discover what matters, and that will help you on future questions. That is kind of the whole point of this whole demonstration here. So of course, if you have made it to this slide, thanks for watching. You've made it all the way to the end. Like and subscribe to help the channel. Leave a comment. That helps with engagement as well. But I know that a lot of you guys don't really like doing that. So that's okay, though. Because really, a lot of you have been very, very eager to contact me via email, which is fine. It's more than okay. Because you can ask whatever question you want, however specific you want. And you don't have to worry about anybody seeing it. And it being weird and me answering it in the comments and having to keep track of yet another thing. But yeah, I highly encourage you to reach out if there's something that doesn't work for you or if it confuses you. In particular, I skipped a couple of things. I kind of glossed over a few technical things here for the sake of keeping runtime down. So if those are the kinds of things that give you trouble, don't hesitate to reach out, and I would be more than happy to go over that with you. Most likely in a free consultation. Most of your questions can be taken care of just via email without even setting up a time to talk. But if it is more involved, a 30-45 minute conversation, which falls within the purview of my free consultations, generally takes care of it. So yeah, I will see you guys in the next one.